Berlin, April 22, 1945. The ground trembles. Dust drifts down from the concrete ceiling of the Führer bunker. Above, the city burns, orange plumes rising against a sky stained with smoke. The air reeks of fuel, sweat, and despair deep underground. In a dimly lit map room, Adolf Hitler leans over a table scattered with maps that no longer matter. His right hand shakes uncontrollably as he traces a red line that's already been erased by the truth. Around him stand his last loyal men, Keitel, Jodl, Krebs, Bergdorf. Their faces drained of color, their eyes fixed on the floor. The artillery thunder grows louder. Each explosion feels closer. Every mark on the wall maps the Reich's slow collapse. Hitler speaks, his voice hoarse, broken, still clinging to an illusion that Steiner's counterattack will save Berlin. But silence answers him. No one dares to speak. At that moment, something inside him shifts. The realization begins to crack through the walls of delusion. The empire he built on fear and lies is dying, and for the first time, he can feel it. The war he began is ending, not with victory, but with ruin. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing from every direction. 6 years earlier, Hitler had stood before cheering crowds, promising a 1,000-year empire. Now, after only 12, it was disintegrating in fire and dust. From the east, the Red Army was closing in with unstoppable momentum. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belorussian Front and Ivan Kohn's First Ukrainian Front pressed through the remnants of German defenses, converging on Berlin like the jaws of a steel trap. Each day, Soviet artillery fired over 2 million shells into the shrinking German perimeter. Entire divisions that once conquered Europe were now little more than frightened boys and old men in ill-fitting uniforms. From the west, the Allied armies had crossed the Rhine. American, British, and French forces were racing through central Germany, liberating towns and uncovering the horrors of the concentration camps. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German air supremacy, had been reduced to scattered squadrons hiding from Allied bombers. The skies that once carried the swastika now belonged to the enemy. Inside Germany, starvation and fear had replaced faith in victory. Entire cities were flattened. Refugees streamed westward in endless columns, desperate to escape the Soviet advance. Women carried children wrapped in blankets, their faces gray from hunger and exhaustion. For many Germans, it was not about defending Hitler anymore. It was about surviving the collapse of everything. Yet inside the Führer bunker, beneath the Chancellery gardens, a different world existed. 17 meters below the surface, Hitler maintained the illusion of control. He still held morning briefings, still issued orders to armies that no longer existed. Maps showed divisions on paper, ghosts of units destroyed weeks earlier. His generals dared not contradict him. To question was treason. To tell the truth was suicide. The atmosphere was thick with dread and decay. Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, injected him with cocktails of amphetamines, barbiturates, and hormones to keep him functioning. His once erect posture was gone. He shuffled with a stoop, his face ashen, his hands trembling. But his voice, when raised, still carried the fury of a man who refused to face reality. On April 12, Franklin D. Roosevelt died. The bunker momentarily buzzed with false hope. Hitler saw it as a sign, the turning point, he muttered. Perhaps, he thought, the Allies would fracture without Roosevelt's leadership. Perhaps there was still time for a separate peace with the West. But within days, that illusion too was shattered. The Americans advanced faster than ever. The British took Bremen. The Soviets stormed into the suburbs of Berlin. Still, Hitler refused to leave. He told his staff, "I will stay in Berlin. I will fight to the end. I will not fall into the hands of the enemy." He ordered that the city be defended to the last man, turning Berlin into a fortress. Every street corner became a barricade. Teenagers from the Hitler Youth were handed Panzerfausts and sent to fight tanks. Men who refused were hanged from lampposts with signs reading "Traitor." Inside the bunker, daily briefings grew shorter, darker. The generals could no longer disguise the truth. Hitler's rage became unpredictable, shifting from cold silence to violent outbursts. He still dreamed of Army Group Steiner, a phantom force he believed would strike north and push back the Soviets. But Steiner's units had already disintegrated. No fuel, no ammunition, no men left to fight. Meanwhile, the Allied air raids over Berlin continued without mercy. Entire districts were reduced to rubble. Flames rose high enough to be seen by Soviet scouts miles away. The Reich's capital, once the symbol of Hitler's power, was now a graveyard. Every explosion above reminded those below of what was coming. But even then, Hitler clung to delusion. He told his staff that Germany's defeat was not his fault, that his generals had betrayed him, that the people had failed him. In his mind, he was still the victim, not the cause, of catastrophe. And yet, somewhere behind his vacant stare, the truth was beginning to press against the walls of denial. Because even in that underground tomb of loyalty and fear, the sounds of the approaching Red Army were impossible to ignore. By mid-April 1945, the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery had become the final stage of a dying empire. It was a labyrinth of concrete corridors and steel doors, humming with stale air and fear. Electric lights flickered overhead, illuminating the faces of the last believers, the opportunists, and those too terrified to leave. The inner circle was smaller now. Joseph Goebbels, still fanatically loyal, moved through the halls with his wife Magda. Their 6 children occasionally glimpsed playing quietly in corners they didn't understand. Martin Bormann, calculating and severe, controlled access to Hitler like a gatekeeper of fate. Heinrich Himmler, once the embodiment of Nazi power, had begun secret peace negotiations behind Hitler's back, a betrayal that, when revealed, would fill the Führerbunker with volcanic rage. Among them were others: General Hans Krebs, the chief of the Army General Staff, tired and resigned; Colonel Nicholas von Below, Hitler's Luftwaffe adjutant, maintaining the fiction of air support that no longer existed; Traudl Jung, Hitler's young secretary, typing his final orders as the world above disintegrated. The bunker had its routines, hollow rituals of a vanishing regime. Each morning, Hitler would emerge from his private quarters, stooped and visibly aged, clutching trembling notes in his left hand. He would study maps on the table, his gaze darting across red and blue lines that no longer represented reality. He would then issue orders, movements, counterattacks, reassignments, for armies that had ceased to exist. The generals would nod, salute, and leave the room knowing that nothing he commanded could be done. Outside, Berlin had become a battlefield. The Soviet artillery was now within range of the city center. Shells crashed into the ruins of the Reichstag and the Brandenburg Gate. The thunder was constant. The civilians who hadn't fled lived in basements and subway tunnels, surviving on whatever remained of their food rations. For Hitler, however, the collapse was not military, it was personal. His dream of conquest had been built on total control, on the absolute loyalty of his people and his generals. Now, in the final days, that control was disintegrating. He ranted about betrayal, Göring, Himmler, even the German people themselves. "If the war is lost," he declared, "the people are unworthy of me." That bitterness was codified into the Nero Decree, issued on March 19, 1945. It ordered the destruction of Germany's own infrastructure, bridges, factories, railways, to deny them to the advancing Allies. In effect, Hitler demanded his own nation's ruin. But Albert Speer, the Reich's Minister of Armaments, defied him. Speer knew that obedience now meant extinction. Quietly, he ordered local commanders to ignore Hitler's instructions. It was a small rebellion in a government built on fear. As Soviet troops pushed deeper into the city, communication lines began to fail. The once imposing German command network, the structure that had coordinated invasions across continents, had collapsed into a handful of radios and panicked reports. Even the bunker's telephone lines were unreliable. Messages from outside arrived hours late, often outdated by the time they reached Hitler's desk. In these claustrophobic final days, the Führer's mental and physical deterioration became unmistakable. He could barely walk without assistance. His hands trembled violently, a visible sign of Parkinsonian symptoms. His speech slurred, his energy flickered between manic fury and hollow silence. Yet, despite the obvious decline, those around him maintained the facade, calling him Mein Führer, standing when he entered, pretending that the war could still be won. By April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, reality had grown impossible to ignore. The Red Army was less than 10 miles from the city center. Outside, what remained of the Wehrmacht fired the last of its artillery in a futile salute to their leader. Inside, Goebbels organized a small birthday reception. It was grim, perfunctory. A few officers presented flowers. Hitler nodded mechanically. When he stepped outside the bunker briefly that afternoon, witnesses saw him as a ghost of the man who once hypnotized nations. Pale, hunched, one arm shaking uncontrollably as he greeted a group of Hitler youth soldiers. Most of them would die within days defending the ruins of Berlin. That night, as the bunker shook under Soviet shelling, Hitler withdrew deeper into denial. He still believed that General Felix Steiner could mount a counterattack north of Berlin. That somehow, against all odds, German divisions could rally once more. But the reports from the front told the truth. Steiner had no tanks, no fuel, and barely any men left to command. On the morning of April 22nd, Hitler gathered his generals for a final situation conference. The moment that would mark the breaking point, the instant when even he could no longer escape the truth, was drawing near. Point 1. The human angle, the disintegration of a man. By the time the war reached Berlin, Adolf Hitler was no longer the towering figure who had commanded stadiums filled with hundreds of thousands. The man who once embodied fiery charisma had deteriorated into a frail, trembling shell, consumed by paranoia and delusion. His body betrayed him first. The tremor in his left hand, visible since 1943, had worsened. His steps were slow, uneven, his back stooped forward, his face lined and sunken. Hitler's physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, had been injecting him with a daily mix of stimulants and sedatives, Pervitin, cocaine-based nasal drops, barbiturates, anything to keep him upright and functioning. Each injection prolonged his decline. Those closest to him watched the transformation in silence. Traudl Young, his secretary, later described his eyes as gray, dull, and lifeless, and his speech as slower, raspier. Yet, when anger rose, the old fury would erupt. Bursts of shouting, fist-pounding, wild accusations. It was as though rage was the only energy left inside him. Psychologically, Hitler's world had shrunk to a bunker map and a handful of delusions. He refused to accept that Germany's armies were shattered, its cities destroyed, its people starving. He spoke often of treason. Göring, Himmler, even entire army groups he claimed had betrayed their oath. To him, defeat was not the result of strategic collapse, but moral weakness in those around him. In private, he began to retreat into fantasy. He reminisced about the early victories, Poland, France, the Balkans, and how fate had once seemed to favor him. He talked of miracle weapons that would turn the tide, jet fighters, V-2 rockets, new submarines. Each day, reality eroded further, replaced by fragments of a world that no longer existed. Inside the bunker, conversations had to be carefully phrased. One careless word could trigger an outburst. Officers rehearsed their reports before speaking, trying to soften the grim truth. No one dared to contradict him directly. They all knew that even in his decline, Hitler's wrath could destroy lives instantly. But those who saw him daily, Young, Linge, Spee, could sense the weight of his despair. He had stopped shaving regularly. He rarely ate. He spent hours in silence, pacing, muttering to himself. In one moment, he would speak of leading the final defense of Berlin. The next, he would stare blankly at the wall, whispering that everything was over. The transformation was complete. From dictator to prisoner, from conqueror to captive of his own delusions. 2. The military angle, generals trapped in denial. For the officers in the bunker, the final weeks were a grim theater of obedience. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and General Alfred Jodl still delivered situation reports as if the Wehrmacht were capable of coordinated defense. But in truth, German command had disintegrated. Divisions that once numbered tens of thousands now existed only as scattered platoons. Army Group Vistula, which Hitler had pinned his last hopes on, was in ruins. General Gotthard Heinrichi, one of Germany's most capable defensive commanders, had been dismissed after ordering tactical withdrawals, a rational move, but one Hitler interpreted as cowardice. Every general who spoke of retreat faced the same accusation: betrayal. In conference after conference, Hitler refused to accept the reality on the ground. When reports showed Soviet troops crossing the Oder, he exploded. "Steiner will attack," he shouted, referring to General Felix Steiner, whose corps no longer existed as a fighting force. No supplies, no tanks, no coordination. But Hitler clung to the idea like a drowning man to driftwood. The generals understood the futility. Heinrichi, Bussy, Weidling, all knew Berlin was lost. Yet, they continued to deliver reports, to draw arrows on maps, to obey orders they knew were impossible. Why? Because rebellion meant death. And even as the Reich collapsed, discipline remained absolute. Those who escaped the bunker in those final days often described the same atmosphere: silence, fear, and the mechanical ritual of doomed men pretending to strategize. The war, in a military sense, was already over. What remained was not strategy, but theater, a hollow performance staged for a leader who could no longer see the truth. 3. The enemy angle. The Red Army's relentless advance. While Hitler's inner circle sank into delusion, the Soviet war machine was executing the final act of vengeance. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front approached Berlin from the east, crossing the Oder and breaking through the last German defensive lines. To the south, Ivan Kohn's First Ukrainian Front was sweeping north, racing to claim the prize of Berlin before Zhukov could. It became a brutal competition between Soviet commanders, not just to end the war, but to determine who would deliver the final blow to Hitler's empire. On April 16, 1945, the Soviets launched the Battle of the Silo Heights, one of the largest artillery bombardments in history. Over 9,000 guns thundered across the front, lighting up the night sky with a crimson glare. Entire German positions were annihilated in minutes. Survivors described the earth shaking as though the world itself were ending. Despite desperate resistance, the German lines broke within days. Thousands of soldiers surrendered, many without firing a shot. The Soviets pushed forward relentlessly, using sheer numbers and overwhelming firepower. Berlin, just 50 miles away, was now within their grasp. To the Red Army, this was more than a military operation, it was retribution. The ruins of Stalingrad and Leningrad still burned in memory. Every block, every street taken in Berlin was vengeance for millions of Soviet lives lost. Propaganda units framed it as justice. The heart of fascism must be destroyed. By the third week of April, the encirclement was nearly complete. Soviet forward units reached the Teltow Canal in the south and Weissensee in the north. Berlin was surrounded. The noose had tightened. In the bunker, reports of Soviet breakthroughs arrived every few hours. Each one chipped away at Hitler's delusions. Yet, even as the Red Army closed in, he insisted on impossible counterattacks, phantom movements by imaginary divisions. The generals understood. The Führer no longer commanded an army. He commanded an illusion. Point 4. The technological angle, the mirage of the Wunderwaffe. Even as the Reich crumbled, Hitler's faith in technology remained unshaken. He clung to the belief that a single breakthrough, a wonder weapon, or Wunderwaffe, could reverse the tide of the war. It was not strategy that obsessed him now, but salvation through invention. In the months before Berlin fell, he spoke endlessly of the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Sleek, fast, and deadly, it could outrun any Allied aircraft. But Hitler's interference had crippled its potential. Instead of deploying it as a defensive interceptor, he had ordered it converted into a blitzbomber, a jet capable of carrying bombs against Allied ground targets. The delay cost months of production and robbed the Luftwaffe of its last advantage. By the time Me-262s reached combat units in significant numbers, fuel shortages and pilot losses rendered them irrelevant. Then there were the V-weapons, the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket. They had terrorized London and Antwerp in 1944, killing thousands, but they were strategically meaningless. The resources poured into them drained Germany's war economy while achieving no tactical gain. Yet, even in the final days, Hitler still called them instruments of divine retribution. He believed they would force the Allies to negotiate. In reality, the wonder weapons were products of desperation. Behind the propaganda, their development reflected the scientific brilliance of German engineers, men like Wernher von Braun and Walter Dornberger, but also the moral rot of a system built on forced labor. Tens of thousands of slave workers from concentration camps died building rockets in underground tunnels at Mittelbau-Dora, buried under collapsing ceilings or executed for exhaustion. As the Soviets neared Berlin, the remaining prototypes of the V-3 cannon, jet bombers, and experimental U-boats lay abandoned in hidden facilities. The promise of the future, machines that might have changed warfare, was swallowed by the ruins of the present. Even as Soviet shells struck within earshot, Hitler clung to this fantasy of technological redemption. "The enemy has quantity," he told his generals. "We have quality." But in those final days, quality meant nothing without soldiers, fuel, or time. Technology had become a mirror, reflecting not Germany's strength, but Hitler's inability to accept defeat. 5. The leadership angle, Goebbels' theater of lies. If Hitler's faith lay in machines, Joseph Goebbels' faith remained in words. In the final months of the Reich, Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda continued to broadcast triumphant bulletins even as Soviet artillery could be heard across Berlin. Newspapers spoke of strategic withdrawals and counterattacks by Steiner, though the city's residents could see through the windows that such claims were absurd. Goebbels understood the truth. He was too shrewd not to. Yet, he saw propaganda as a weapon to maintain control, even in defeat. His speeches grew more fanatical, more apocalyptic. He told the German people that total destruction was preferable to surrender. If the German people are not strong enough to fight for their Führer, then they deserve to perish. Inside the bunker, Goebbels remained one of Hitler's last true believers. He rarely left the Führer's side. His loyalty bordered on religious devotion, and he interpreted Hitler's coming death as a sacred act, a martyrdom for the idea of National Socialism. He brought his family into the bunker not to survive, but to die beside their leader. To the very end, Goebbels maintained his theater of lies. He drafted declarations for newspapers that no longer circulated, radio statements for transmitters that no longer worked. Even as he typed them, he knew they would never be heard. But propaganda had always been about illusion, and illusion was all that remained. For the civilians outside, however, the spell had broken. Goebbels' speeches, once intoxicating, now rang hollow. Berliners had no time for ideology while scouring rubble for water or food. Mothers tore down Hitler's portraits to light fires. Children dug trenches, not out of faith, but out of fear. The propaganda machine, like the Reich itself, was running on fumes, sustained only by habit and terror. And yet, in those echoing concrete corridors beneath the Chancellery, Goebbels still believed. If Hitler was the fallen god, Goebbels was the last priest, performing a ritual for a faith already dead. 6. The moral angle, the final betrayal. The most tragic aspect of those last days was not the collapse of a regime, but the collapse of belief, the shattering of an entire generation's illusion. For years, Hitler had promised glory, order, and national pride. His words had seduced millions. He had convinced a broken nation that it was destined to rule the world. But by 1945, the promises were ash and smoke. Germany's cities lay in ruins. 11 million soldiers were dead or missing. Civilians starved in cellars while Allied bombers still circled overhead. In Berlin, the myth of the Führer was dying faster than the Reich itself. Civilians whispered the unthinkable, that the man who had sworn to protect Germany had destroyed it instead. Soldiers returning from the front spoke of impossible orders, of commanders shot for retreating, of divisions annihilated in senseless last stands. By late April, even the Volkssturm, the civilian militia of old men and boys, had begun to desert. Some threw away their rifles, tore the insignia from their sleeves, and disappeared into the ruins. Others stayed, not for loyalty, but because there was nowhere else to go. The moral foundation of Hitler's Germany had imploded. It was no longer a question of victory or defeat, it was a reckoning. And yet, in those final moments, there was also a strange, silent clarity among many Germans. They had believed the Reich invincible, and now they watched its fall. They had worshipped the Führer, and now they saw him as a frail, shaking man hiding underground. The contrast was unbearable. When the end came, few still cared about ideology. The war had stripped away illusion. What remained was survival, and the haunting awareness of what had been done in their name. April the 22nd, 1945. The air inside the Führerbunker was heavier than ever. Hours before, the Soviet artillery barrage had reached the city center. Every detonation above ground sent a fine mist of plaster dust falling from the ceiling. The walls trembled. The maps on the situation table shook in their frames. It was shortly after 3 p.m. when Hitler entered the situation conference room. The narrow chamber, lined with maps of a Europe that no longer existed, was filled with his most senior officers: Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, General Alfred Jodl, General Hans Krebs, and Colonel General Wilhelm Bergdorf. They stood in silence, papers in hand, waiting for the day's report from the front. Hitler lowered himself into his chair, his face pale, his left hand twitching uncontrollably. He asked about Army Group Steiner, the mythical force he still believed could counterattack from the north and halt the Soviet advance. Keitel hesitated. Jodl cleared his throat. Finally, Krebs spoke the words no one wanted to say. Steiner will not attack. He explained, carefully, that Steiner's units were scattered, lacking ammunition, vehicles, and communication. There would be no counteroffensive. For a moment, the room was silent. The sound of distant explosions filled the void. Then Hitler's body stiffened. His eyes widened, staring at the table. His hands clenched into fists. Suddenly, he erupted. Witnesses later described it as the most violent outburst they had ever seen. Hitler rose from his chair, trembling with rage, his voice breaking between screams and sobs. He accused his generals of betrayal, of cowardice, incompetence, treason. He shouted that the army had failed him, that the SS had failed him, that the German people themselves were unworthy of his leadership. His words poured out in torrents of fury and despair. Everything is lost. The war is lost. If you gentlemen think this is the end, then go ahead, shoot yourselves. Keitel and Jodl stood motionless, eyes fixed on the floor. No one spoke. The tirade lasted for nearly half an hour. When it ended, Hitler collapsed into his chair, exhausted, breathing heavily. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, in a low, rasping voice, he said the words that changed everything. That's it. The war is lost. I shall stay in Berlin. I shall not leave the capital. The end will be here. No one argued that no one dared outside the conference room. Word spread quickly through the bunker. Hitler had admitted defeat for the first time. 4 years, his will had been the center of the Reich's universe. Now, that will had cracked. The myth of the invincible Führer had died in that small concrete room. Later that evening, Traudl Young saw him walking down the corridor, head bowed, shoulders slumped. He looked decades older. He seemed like a man who had given up, she recalled. It was no longer the Führer speaking. It was just a broken old man. But even in resignation, Hitler's obsession with control did not fade. He ordered that all front lines continue to resist. Every soldier, every civilian, every child was to fight to the death. The Nero decree remained in effect. Germany was to be destroyed rather than surrendered. Yet his tone had changed. It was no longer a command driven by belief, but by bitterness, a final act of vengeance against the world that had refused to bend to his will. After the conference, he withdrew to his private quarters. The bunker fell into hushed whispers. Outside, the thunder of Soviet artillery grew closer. The Soviets were less than 5 kilometers from the Chancellery. The ground above shook as shells landed in the Tiergarten. That night, Hitler received word that Hermann Göring, his longtime deputy, had sent a telegram from Berchtesgaden. Göring claimed that, as the designated successor, he was ready to assume leadership if Hitler was incapacitated. To Hitler, it was proof of betrayal, the final stab from within his own circle. He ordered Göring's arrest. Then came news that Heinrich Himmler had begun negotiating with the Western Allies. Another betrayal. Another confirmation that the empire he built on loyalty and fear had crumbled into treachery and self-preservation. By midnight, He was pacing his quarters, muttering, "Everything is falling apart, everything." In the adjoining room, Eva Braun, calm and composed, was writing letters to her family. She refused to leave him. "I will die with my husband," she told Young. Above them, Berlin continued to burn. Entire districts were gone. The Soviets were closing in from all sides. But inside the Führerbunker, the war had already ended, not with a surrender, but with an admission that came too late to save anyone. The realization had come not as a moment of clarity, but as a collapse, the instant when delusion could no longer protect him from reality. The man who once dictated the fate of millions now faced his own, sealed beneath the ruins of his empire. The decision was made in silence. Hitler would not flee, would not surrender, and would not be taken alive. Berlin would be his last stand, and his grave. The following morning, April 23, 1945, the bunker's routine resumed, but something fundamental had changed. The illusion of hope was gone. Officers spoke in whispers. Goebbels remained close to Hitler, now less as a minister and more as a shadow, repeating words of devotion while the walls shook from the artillery above. Eva Braun, serene amid the chaos, refused every plea to leave. She dressed elegantly each day, as if the war were still far away, lipstick, perfume, pearls. When others begged her to escape south with the remaining aircraft, she smiled faintly. "Do you think I would leave him now?" In those final days, Hitler began preparing for death with the same precision he once applied to invasions. He summoned Martin Bormann and dictated his last political testament, a document that blamed the war on the Jews, denounced his generals, and appointed successors who would never rule. His tone was calm, almost detached, as he rehearsed his own end like a script. He no longer spoke of victory, only of destiny. Outside the bunker, Berlin was disintegrating street by street. Soviet tanks crashed through the outer defenses, grinding across the ruins. German defenders, boys of the Hitler Youth, remnants of SS divisions, police units, fought with desperation. The Battle of Berlin had become an apocalypse of rubble, smoke, and blood. By April 25, the Soviets had encircled the city completely. Hitler's world was now confined to a few underground rooms. The last radio messages from the front were erratic, fragments of chaos. Army Group Vistula was gone. Communication with the outside world had all but ceased. That evening, as the shelling intensified, Hitler gathered his staff for a final briefing. His voice was flat, emotionless. "The situation cannot be changed," he said quietly. "I shall remain in Berlin until the end." He dismissed everyone with a wave of his hand. Later, as the others left, he turned to Goebbels and said, "You know what to do." Goebbels nodded. He already had. Meanwhile, acts of defiance and despair unfolded throughout the bunker. General Helmuth Weidling, the commander of Berlin's defense, tried to negotiate terms for a surrender, hoping to spare what remained of the civilian population. Hitler forbade it. "Berlin will not capitulate," he said. "The Führer's capital will fight to the last man." On April 28, a small radio message arrived. The BBC had reported Himmler's attempt to negotiate peace with the Allies. Hitler read the note in silence. Then, with sudden fury, he called Himmler a traitor, the most despicable man who ever lived. He ordered Himmler's arrest and execution, though it was already too late. That same night, as the shelling reached a crescendo, Hitler and Eva Braun were married in a brief civil ceremony. It took place in the early hours of April 29, in a small conference room near the map table. The witnesses were Goebbels and Bormann. The officiant, a minor official from the Interior Ministry, recorded the event as calmly as if it were a simple administrative task. Afterward, the newlyweds shared a modest meal, pasta and wine. For a brief moment, the bunker was quiet. Those present later recalled the surreal calm, as if time itself had paused. But above them, the city continued to burn. Within hours, Hitler dictated his last will and political testament. He confirmed his intention to die rather than be captured. He named Grand Admiral Karl Donitz as his successor and urged his followers to continue the struggle. Words that would have no meaning once the gunfire stopped. By the evening of April 29, The Soviets were only a few hundred meters away. The Reichstag was under siege. Machine gun fire echoed through the Chancellery gardens. Hitler's staff could hear the screams of wounded soldiers above. He spent that night in quiet isolation, sitting on a couch with Eva, speaking little. Witnesses said he appeared strangely peaceful, a man whose final decision had brought him a grim form of relief. He had lost the world, but he had regained control over one thing: the manner of his own end. The next morning, April 30th, 1945, he said farewell to his staff. One by one, they entered his office. He shook hands, murmured thanks, and told them to save themselves if they could. "The war is lost," he said simply. "You may leave." At 2:30 p.m., he and Eva retired to his private study. The door closed behind them. A few minutes later, a single gunshot echoed through the bunker. When his aides entered, they found Hitler slumped on the couch, a pistol in his right hand, a bullet wound to his temple. Eva Braun sat beside him, lifeless, a faint scent of cyanide in the air. Linge and Bormann carried the bodies upstairs to the Chancellery garden. Amid the craters and smoke, they placed the corpses in a shallow shell hole, poured petrol over them, and set them alight. Soviet shells fell nearby as the flames consumed the remains of the Third Reich's creator. In that moment, brief, violent, and final, the man who had brought Europe to ruin ended his life within the ruins of his own design. The war was not yet over, but its architect was gone. When the sound of Hitler's final gunshot faded, what remained of the Reich dissolved into chaos. The walls of the bunker, once filled with the tense murmurs of officers and secretaries, fell eerily quiet. Smoke from the cremation fire drifted through the broken vents. The odor of fuel and gunpowder mixed with the damp air of concrete corridors. The man who had commanded millions was now ash-scattered in a shell crater. For those left behind, the world had become meaningless. Joseph Goebbels, now self-appointed chancellor by Hitler's decree, gathered his wife Magda and their 6 children in a nearby room. Above ground, Soviet troops were less than 100 meters away. Berlin had become a furnace of artillery, flame, and death. But in the bunker, an even darker decision was about to unfold. On May 1, 1945, Goebbels sent a message to General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the Soviet 8th Guards Army, proposing a ceasefire. It was a feint, one final gesture of control before the inevitable. Hours later, Goebbels and his wife poisoned their children as they slept, then took their own lives. Their bodies were found beside the bunker's emergency exit, half-burned by nearby explosions. With that, the Nazi leadership ceased to exist. Above ground, Soviet soldiers pushed through the last defenses of the Reich Chancellery. The Reichstag fell that same day. The red banner of the Soviet 150th Rifle Division was raised on its roof, a symbol seen across the world. The Battle of Berlin, one of the most brutal urban sieges in history, was over. In the rubble of the German capital, the remains of the Third Reich were buried, literally and figuratively. The total casualties of the Battle of Berlin are estimated at over 80,000 Soviet soldiers dead, more than 90,000 German soldiers killed, and tens of thousands of civilians caught in between. Entire neighborhoods were erased from existence. But even in victory, the Soviet soldiers moved through scenes that defied triumph: the broken streets, the faces of the starving, the silence of a city that had once been the heart of Europe. Berlin had been transformed into a monument of despair. News of Hitler's death spread slowly at first, shrouded in uncertainty. The Soviets announced it cautiously, not believing at first that the dictator was truly dead. In the West, Allied command centers waited for confirmation. Joseph Stalin himself demanded proof, dispatching teams to locate the remains, a mission that would ignite decades of speculation and secrecy. Meanwhile, in northern Germany, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, who had been named Hitler's successor, tried to form a new government from the ruins. Operating from Flensburg, he attempted to negotiate surrender terms that would allow the German army to capitulate to the Western Allies while continuing to resist the Soviets. But the war was finished. The Allies were done with negotiation. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already been executed by partisans and hung upside down in a Milan square. In Berlin, the Führer had taken his own life. The twin pillars of European fascism had collapsed within days of each other, one at the hands of his people, the other by his own. The German High Command began surrendering piecemeal. Some units in the West laid down their arms to the British and Americans, hoping for leniency. Others in the East continued to fight, unwilling to be captured by the Red Army. But the end was no longer a matter of choice. On May 7, 1945, in a schoolhouse in Reims, France, German representatives signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces. At 2:41 a.m., the document was sealed. The following day, it was ratified again in Berlin-Karlshorst under Soviet supervision. The war in Europe, the greatest and most destructive in human history, was officially over. In the cities and towns of Europe, people poured into the streets, dancing, crying, embracing. Bells rang. Flags unfurled. For the first time in 6 years, the guns of Europe fell silent. Yet for Germany, the silence was not peace. It was the stillness of ruin. The Reich had been reduced to ashes. Its capital lay in fragments. Its leader was dead. But for the millions who had suffered under his rule, the occupied, the enslaved, the murdered, his death was not an end, but a reckoning. The world had survived him in the aftermath of Berlin's fall. The search for Adolf Hitler's body became one of the most secretive and contested missions of the 20th century. The Soviets were determined to find proof, not only of his death, but of their own triumph. On May 2, 1945, Soviet troops from the 79th Rifle Corps discovered the entrance to the Führerbunker beneath the ruined Chancellery Gardens. The smell of decay filled the air. Burned documents, broken furniture, and the charred remains of a dozen bodies littered the area. Among the wreckage, investigators found 2 corpses partially buried in a shallow crater, burned almost beyond recognition. One wore remnants of a military tunic, the other, fragments of a blue dress. Nearby lay a small pistol. Soviet officers suspected immediately that they had found Hitler and Eva Braun. The bodies were taken for forensic examination by SMERSH, the Soviet Counterintelligence Service. Dental records, smuggled out of Berlin by Hitler's personal dental staff, confirmed the identification beyond doubt. Yet Stalin, ever suspicious, refused to release the findings. Publicly, he suggested that Hitler had escaped, possibly to Argentina or Spain. The myth began there, born not from conspiracy theorists, but from the paranoia of the Soviet premier himself. In truth, Hitler's body, along with those of Eva Braun, Joseph Goebbels, and others, was secretly buried multiple times by Soviet forces, each relocation deeper into East German soil. Finally, in 1970, under orders from the KGB, the remains were exhumed, cremated, and the ashes scattered in the Elbe River. Only fragments of skull and jawbone were preserved, locked away in Soviet archives. The West would not see photographic evidence of these remains until decades later. Meanwhile, Germany and Europe began the long process of reckoning with the cost of his war. Over 60 million dead, cities erased from maps, generations scarred. Berlin itself was carved into zones of occupation. The Soviet, American, British, and French sectors would soon become fault lines in a new ideological struggle, the Cold War. For many Germans, the immediate post-war years were not liberation, but survival. Families searched through rubble for food. Trains carried refugees from the East, survivors of bombings, prisoners of war, and victims of Nazi displacement. Millions were homeless. In the concentration camps newly liberated by Allied troops, the full magnitude of the Nazi crimes came to light. The world saw Buchenwald, Dachau, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, the unimaginable revealed in photographs and film reels. The name Hitler, once uttered in fear or adoration, became synonymous only with horror. In Nuremberg, between 1945 and 1946, surviving Nazi leaders were tried for war crimes and crimes against humanity. For the first time in history, a world court sought to hold men accountable for the deliberate extermination of millions. The courtroom echoed with evidence, films, documents, testimonies, each detail dismantling the myth of Nazi glory that Hitler had built on lies. The Führer's thousand-year Reich had lasted barely 12 years. Its end had come not through glory or martyrdom, but through the slow suffocation of delusion, a man trapped in a bunker beneath the ruins of his own empire. And yet, even decades later, his shadow lingered. In post-war Germany, veterans whispered his name in shame or disbelief. In distant lands, fugitives of the SS hid under false identities. And in dark corners of ideology, his image was twisted into a perverse symbol for those who refused to face the truth of what he had done. But history would not absolve him. Every record, every survivor, every mass grave told the same story, that Hitler's death had not balanced the scales of justice, only marked the end of his reign of destruction. The true reckoning would belong to memory, and to the world that had to rebuild itself from what he had left behind. In the ashes of Berlin, where the Reich once stood, new banners rose. The Soviet flag over the Reichstag. The Allied insignia over occupied Germany. The map of Europe was redrawn, but the scars remained. And though the world turned its eyes toward rebuilding, one question remained timeless, not how Hitler died, but how millions had followed him into ruined Berlin, spring of 1945. Smoke still curled from the ruins of the Chancellery Gardens. The air carried the scent of damp ash, oil, and iron. Above ground, the city lay silent, stripped of all illusion. Beneath it, the architect of that silence had vanished, swallowed by the destruction he had unleashed. Adolf Hitler's final days were not heroic, not tragic, not even mysterious. They were the logical end of a man who believed himself greater than consequence. His empire, built on fear and fanaticism, had devoured itself from within. The 1,000-year Reich had died before it could even grow old. History often searches for lessons in such endings. But perhaps the lesson of April 1945 is not one of strategy or politics, but of delusion, the danger of mistaking power for permanence. For all his armies, for all his speeches, Hitler ended alone, beneath the earth, abandoned by the world he sought to dominate. The day he realized the war was lost was not simply the collapse of a regime. It was the shattering of a myth. The myth that willpower alone could bend reality. The myth that ideology could conquer humanity. The myth that a single man could stand above history itself. What remained afterward was not glory, but silence. The silence of millions gone. The silence of cities burned to dust. The silence of a Europe learning, too late, the cost of obedience. And yet, within that silence, the seeds of renewal took root. Germany would rebuild. Europe would reconcile. The nations that bled across its soil would turn from hatred toward something resembling unity. The scars would never fade, but they would remind the world of the abyss it had once stared into. 80 years later, the story of Hitler's fall still holds its power, not because of his rise, but because of his end. Because in the flicker of that final fire in the Chancellery Garden, the illusion of invincibility burned away, revealing the truth that tyrants always forget. That every empire built on destruction will, one day, destroy itself.